Hi there. I wanted to see how you're doing. I'm sat again in our lovely graveyard. I felt a few speckles of rain there, but that's fine because it's so warm. It's almost refreshing. I wonder where you're watching this from and how you're doing at the moment. But laying that aside for a moment, I'm reading in 2 Chronicles, the scriptures. This is from the Old Testament. It says 2 Chronicles 7. You know, King David was a warrior king, and he wanted to build a temple for God, and God said to him, no, don't do that. You've got blood on your hands. I want your son Solomon. Now Solomon was amazing because God said to him, I'll give you anything you want. He said, above all things, I need wisdom to rule your people, because who can lead them without wisdom? So God said to him, because you've asked for wisdom, not for money or long life, I will give you everything else as well. He became the richest man in the world and all this stuff. But what's interesting is he then built this beautiful temple to God. And on the day of dedication, it says, when Solomon finished praying, they were dedicating the temple as a place where they could worship God, the people of God. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of God filled the temple. Now just think about that for a moment. What does the glory of God look like? And if it was to fill a building, what would that look like? Would it be like smoke? Would it be power? Would it be white light? And then in verse 2 it says, 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 2, the priests, and that was their job to serve in the temple, they could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. So powerful was the presence of God. So powerful was the presence, they couldn't enter in. The weight and power and majesty of God filled that temple. And when all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of God above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, He is good. His love endures forever. Wow. Imagine that. Imagine this little church in Hildenborough. Imagine the glory of God coming here and filling it up so much. Someone says, Tim, we can't go in the building. It's full of the glory of God. The presence of God is so powerful and so manifest in that building, we can't go in. And so much so that all of us on the outside, we fall on our knees worshiping God, and we put our faces to the ground worshiping and worshiping. It says, and they knelt on their pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and they gave thanks to God. Something extraordinary has happened there. Something so amazing. I want that. You could call me mad, I don't know. We don't often hear of the presence of God being so powerful in a church that people can't go in. I have heard of it in some circumstances from people I know and trust. I want that. I want the glory of God here in this place to be so powerful, so tangible that when people come in the building and amongst the presence of the people of the church, they are absolutely aware that they are in the presence of Almighty God. There's no doubt in their mind. Even if they're not a churchgoer, they could walk in that building and instantly recognize that they are in front of God Himself, and they would recognize who God is. You see, knowing God is, I can do sermons and talks on a Sunday and trying to expound the Word of God and explain it. But meeting God face to face, eyeball to eyeball, wow, that's something that's on another level. And I want that for us. I want everyone who comes to this church, I want them to meet God. They won't rely on my testimony telling them about God. They'll know it for themselves. And when you meet God, He fills you inside with such an assurance and knowing of who He is. No one can ever talk you out of it. You know, no one could ever talk me out of the fact that I know God exists, because I've met him. And that's why it's hard to walk away. Once you've met God, you can't really walk away, because you know he exists. You've met him, you've seen him. How do you know that? Well, it's like saying to somebody who's been in love, how do you know you've been in love? How do you know you've been in love? It's very hard to describe it, isn't it? We have words and songs, we have films made about it and books written about it, but until you've actually been in love yourself, it's very hard to understand it. But once you've been in love, you never forget it. And once you've been in love, no one could ever convince you that you haven't been in love, because you know you've been in love. And it's even more like that with God. Once you've met him, once you've met Jesus, no one could convince you you haven't met him. No one can convince you he doesn't exist. That's what it's like. And that's why Christians are willing to die, because people are telling them, I want you to renounce the fact that you know God exists. And they say, I can't do that, because I know he exists, because I've met him. But when you know he exists, you then gain all the benefits of having a Father in heaven who changes your life. He restores your life. Do you know, there was a guy once who had heard about when you become a Christian. He'd heard that not only does God restore your life, that God restores your family's life and other people's life. And he was interested in that. And he'd been a Christian a few years, and he'd heard people saying that God can sometimes speak to you. Anyway, one day he was driving in his car, and he heard a voice, and he recognized it wasn't his head, his imagination. This was a voice that he recognized it must be God, you know. And he said to him, I want you to pray for your father. And so he said, well, he sort of spoke out loud, well, is that you, God? And if it's, what, you want me to pray for my dad? He said, yes, I want you to pray for your father and to pray for your father's mother. Now this guy said, well, that's kind of weird, that's kind of strange. I mean, he's not saying that to God, but he's saying that's really strange, because his father had only known his mother till he was 3. And his mother then had abandoned him and his sister, and this guy was 70. This guy's in the car's father was 70. And the 70-year-old had never known his mother for 67 years. He'd only ever known her till he was 3. And all he'd ever said was, you don't know what it's like, I've never had a mother. He'd always lamented on not having a mother. It damaged his life profoundly. So the guy in the car was saying to God, you know, when you say you want me to pray for my dad, is it because you want my dad to find his mother's grave? Are you going to reveal to my dad with his mother's grave? But he heard nothing. And then 6 months later, he came again. I want you to pray for your father and your father's mother. So he was praying. Anyway, the next day, he got a phone call. And the phone call was from his father. And his father said, look, brace yourself. You're not going to believe this. You know I'm 70. And the kid said, yeah. The guy said, yeah. He goes, well, I got contacted through Genes Reunited, and I found out that I have 5 brothers and sisters I never knew. And I found out, miraculously, that my mother's alive. She's 91 years old. And the guy said, well, that's amazing, Dad, because 6 months ago I felt his dad wasn't a Christian, but he said, I felt God saying to me, I've got to pray for you, and I've got to pray for you and your mother. And I doubted it, because I thought, well, you're 70, she must be dead. And his dad said, well, she's not dead, do you want to meet your grandmother? So the following week they arranged, his father went down to meet his mother for the first time. And this guy went to Frinton-on-Sea to meet his grandma. And he stood in the room when his father met his mother for like the first time. So for 67 years he'd longed to set eyes on his mother. And there he was in the room watching his father look at his mum for the first time, knowing that he'd heard this story of how God restores lives, and not just the life of the follower of him, the follower of God, but the lives of the family as well. So there he was, standing watching his father meet the mother for the first time, and she turned to her son after 67 years and said, "I've always wondered what you look like, and do you know what, son? You're beautiful." And he saw the father's eyes well up. And that's a powerful story, isn't it? Do you want to know why it's a really powerful story? It's a really powerful story because it's my story. It's a true story. It's my Tim, the vicar at Hildenburg. It's my story. You see, that was me. I stood in the room and watched my dad say to his mum, "I love you," and watched my grandma say to my dad for the first time, "You're beautiful," and I've got some photos and videos, and I can only say it was one of the most profound things of my life. Anyway, later on, I met the 5 brothers and sisters, and then a year later, she died. And my dad had always been really angry and upset that he couldn't understand why she'd never made contact. And she explained later on that she'd had many troubles and had different kids, and things were really hard for her, and she felt the only way she could make sense was to go. And you know, he had a lot of unforgiveness and unresolved stuff, and they asked me to take the funeral. So a year later I went down to take the funeral. Great family, my family. And it was a snowy day, and I'm in the graveyard here, but I was in this graveyard up there, and I had my Church of England stuff on, you know, and it was freezing, and I had my robe on, and I remember the guys with the coffin, they were going to lower my grandma in, and I suddenly said, "Stop, please." I said, "Dad, you know, you've known your mum, you've only met her twice, I think now, but I think it would be a big thing for you to lower your mum into the grave, and when you lower her in, Dad, forgive her." So my dad lowered my grandma into the grave, never thinking he'd ever meet her. He never dreamed he'd be lowering her coffin into the grave, and he lowered her coffin in, and when he stood up, he just looked different, like he'd let go of something. And that's the power of forgiveness. You see, unforgiveness holds us prisoner. My dad had been a prisoner to it. It made him ill mentally, and you know, later on after that, he remarried. My mum and dad were divorced. My dad remarried many years ago, and I was asked to take the funeral of his wife, who worked in a hospice, who died of cancer. And when I took the funeral, I went up to see my dad in the Wirral, and the next day we were sitting in the Nationwide, the bank, and it was a building society as well at the time, I think. And this beautiful woman who was dealing with the will and everything, and the bank details of my dad's wife, her name was Kath, beautiful lady. And she just happened to say to my dad, "You know, I hear your son Tim, you took the funeral." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Where do you think your wife is now?" And I've been telling my dad about Jesus, and he just thought it was mumbo jumbo and never wanted to listen. But after the events with his mother and stuff, he was starting to take notice. And then he just said there, I believe my wife's in heaven." And she said, "Don't you want to be there with her?" And my dad said, "I do." And I said, "Dad, I didn't know you believe in heaven." And I said to Dad, "Do you want to be there? Do you want to go to heaven, Dad?" And he said, "Yes." And I said to the lady, "Do you mind if I just speak to my dad for a minute? You can listen." She said, "No." I later found out she was a Christian. And I said, "Dad, do you want to meet Jesus for the first time? Do you want to guarantee that you're going to go to heaven?" And he said, "Yes." And there's this guy who's always denied faith and stuff for years. And I just led my dad to the Lord. I said, "Dad, just say you're sorry to Jesus. Ask him to forgive you. Ask him to come into your life and guide you. And he'll take all the rubbish from your life, all the hurts, habits and hang-ups, all the things you've done wrong to God, to others, to yourself. He'll just take the lot, cleanse you, and you'll be right with God." Done. And there was this whole peace came upon him again, and I never saw it coming. So does God heal lives? Yes, he does. not just mine, but my family's. And God, He can do it for me, He can do it for you. Don't give up hope praying for people. Pray for your neighbours, pray for your family, pray for your friends. May God bless you.